A powerful white judge frames black twin sisters, believing he's untouchable. He manipulates the system, stacks the evidence against them, and watches as their world crumbles. But what he doesn't know? Their father is someone he should fear, someone with power, with secrets, and with a reason to bring him down. Who is this mystery man? And how far will he go to save his daughters? The truth is more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Stay tuned for a story of corruption, justice, and a reckoning long overdue. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The mahogany doors of the courtroom swung open as Malia stepped through, her heart pounding against her ribs. The room was packed wall to wall with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. Camera flashes burst like lightning, making her squint. The weight of all those eyes felt heavy on her shoulders, like a physical burden pressing down on her. The air felt thick with tension, carrying the faint scent of wood polish and anxiety. The creak of old wooden benches and the soft murmur of whispered conversations created an unsettling symphony around her. Each step forward felt like wading through molasses, time stretching out impossibly long as she made her way down the center aisle. The click of her sensible black shoes against the polished floor seemed to echo with each careful step, the sound mingling with the rustling of papers and quiet coughs from the gallery. "Keep your head up," Janice whispered, guiding Malia and Marissa to their seats at the defense table. Her hand was steady and reassuring on Malia's elbow. Malia smoothed her white blouse, a deliberate choice their lawyer had suggested to project innocence and sincerity. The crisp fabric felt cool against her skin, a small comfort in the tense atmosphere that seemed to crackle with anticipation. She could hear the soft scratch of reporters' pens against notepads, documenting every detail of this moment. The rhythmic tapping of a court stenographer's fingers on their machine added to the nervous energy filling the room. Her fingertips tingled with a strange numbness as she gripped the edge of the wooden table before her, feeling the smooth finish worn by countless others who had sat in this same spot, facing their own moments of truth. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor and highlighting dust motes that danced in the air. The familiar faces of their family filled the first row behind them, a wall of silent support. Mom sat there, worry lines creasing her forehead, but her eyes held steady with unwavering support. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Malia wished she could reach back and squeeze her hand, tell her everything would be okay. She noticed how Mom had worn the pearl necklace that Dad had given her, the one she only wore on the most important days. The slight tremor in her mother's shoulders betrayed the emotion she was fighting to contain. A tissue was crumpled in her hand, already worn thin from nervous fidgeting. Uncle James sat beside her, his usually jovial face set in grim determination, while Aunt Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The familiar scent of Mom's perfume drifted forward, a comforting reminder of home and normalcy in this sterile, intimidating space. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Judge Tate entered, his black robes flowing as he took his place at the bench. His stern expression gave nothing away as he settled into his chair, adjusting his reading glasses with practiced precision. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his hair, casting sharp shadows across his weathered face. The American flag behind him seemed to stand especially tall today, its colors vivid against the dark wood paneling. The gold fringe along its edges caught the light, creating tiny sparkles that drew Malia's anxious gaze. The heavy wooden gavel sat ominously on its sound block, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each precious moment before the proceedings began. "Be seated," he commanded, and the rustle of movement filled the room like autumn leaves in the wind. "We will proceed with opening arguments." His words echoed slightly in the high-ceilinged room, lending them extra weight. The subtle creak of chairs and benches gradually settled into silence. Malia felt her spine stiffen as she sat perfectly straight, her years of good posture serving her well in this moment when she needed to appear composed and confident, even as her insides churned with uncertainty. She folded her trembling hands in her lap, willing them to be still as the prosecutor stood, straightening his tie with deliberate slowness. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, sending a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She could feel the weight of the jury's collective gaze, 12 pairs of eyes studying her every movement, every expression, as they prepared to hear the case that would determine her future. The afternoon sun filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, lending an almost ethereal quality to the tense atmosphere. The ancient radiator clanked softly in the corner, a steady rhythm beneath the weighted silence. Outside, a distant siren wailed, its mournful cry seeming to echo the gravity of the moment. The faint rustling of papers and occasional cough from the gallery only heightened the tension that hung thick in the air. The old building seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. Malia sat straighter in her chair as Mr. Peterson, the store clerk, took the witness stand. His hands fidgeted with his tie as he was sworn in, his fingers trembling noticeably as they touched the Bible. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple despite the room's cool temperature. The courthouse's old wooden benches creaked with every slight movement of the spectators, each sound making Malia's nerves jump like a startled bird. The air felt thick with anticipation, heavy as storm clouds before rain, and the musty scent of aged wood and paper filled her nostrils. Prosecutor Harrington approached with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The sound echoed in the hushed courtroom like a metronome counting down to judgment. His shoulders were squared with practiced confidence as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, a gesture that seemed rehearsed to perfection. The fluorescent lights caught the silver at his temples, giving him an air of authority that made Malia's heart sink deeper into her chest. His presence commanded attention, drawing every eye in the room like a magnet. Even the court reporter's fingers seemed to pause over her stenotype machine, waiting. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as he cleared his throat. Her throat felt dry as sandpaper when he spoke, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent chamber. "Mr. Peterson, please tell the court what you witnessed on the night of March 15th. The clerk cleared his throat, the sound rough and nervous. He shifted uncomfortably in the creaking wooden chair, the movement making the ancient wood protest loudly in the silent room. His collar seemed suddenly too tight, and he tugged at it with trembling fingers. Sweat began to bead along his hairline, catching the harsh fluorescent light. The simple gold band on his left hand glinted as he wrung his hands together, a nervous habit that betrayed his discomfort. I was working the late shift at Peterson's corner store. Around 9:30 p.m., 2 young black women came in. His eyes darted toward Malia and Marissa before quickly looking away, guilt flashing across his features like a shadow. His hands twisted in his lap like restless birds, unable to find peace. A muscle twitched in his jaw as he continued, his voice growing quieter with each word, barely carrying across the hushed courtroom. The weight of his testimony seemed to press down on his shoulders. They had hoodies on, but I could see their faces clearly when they approached the counter. The words seemed to physically pain him as they left his mouth, his shoulders hunching as if under an invisible weight. His face had grown pale, making the sweat on his brow stand out even more prominently. Malia's stomach churned, acid rising in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, knuckles white with tension. The rough wood grain of the defense table pressed into her palms, grounding her in reality even as her world tilted sideways. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, drowning out the soft whispers from the gallery behind her. The judge's gavel rested ominously on its sound block, a silent reminder of the power others held over her fate. Every breath felt like a struggle against the crushing weight of injustice. She knew this was a lie, but hearing it spoken under oath made her feel sick, as if the very air in the room had turned toxic. The weight of the false accusation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, threatening to crush her spirit. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a protest against the injustice. Beside her, she could feel Marissa trembling slightly, her sister's fear radiating between them like an electric current. The familiar scent of her sister's lavender shampoo, usually comforting, now seemed to mock the normalcy they'd lost, a reminder of peaceful mornings that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Through it all, Malia fought to maintain her composure, drawing on every ounce of strength she possessed to keep her face neutral, even as her world crumbled around her. Her fingers found the smooth edge of her lucky pencil in her pocket, a small comfort she'd carried since elementary school. The ticking of the large wall clock seemed to mock her, each second carrying her further from the life she'd known and closer to an uncertain future. The afternoon light continued its slow march across the courtroom floor, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its golden rays. The Tuesday morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors as Janice moved with purpose, connecting her laptop to the large monitor mounted on the wall. The courtroom hummed with anticipation, every eye fixed on the screen that loomed over them. The air felt thick with tension, and even the usual whispers and rustling of papers had fallen silent, replaced by the soft whir of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of an old wooden bench. A court officer shifted his weight near the door, his polished badge catching the light. Malia's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Beads of sweat formed at the nape of her neck despite the cool air conditioning. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The truth, unedited and raw, about to play out before everyone's eyes. She could feel her palms growing sweaty and wiped them discreetly on her skirt, the soft fabric offering little comfort. Her throat felt dry, and she wished she'd taken a sip of water earlier when she'd had the chance. The weight of the past months pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. "Your Honor?" Janice's voice rang clear and confident through the hushed courtroom, her shoulders squared with determination. "This is the original, unaltered security footage from the night in question." Her steady hands made quick work of queuing up the video, each click of the mouse echoing in the stillness. She adjusted her reading glasses and double-checked the connections one final time, her movements precise and methodical. The screen flickered to life, showing the familiar interior of the convenience store bathed in fluorescent lighting. The timestamp in the corner read 10:47 p.m. The image was crisp, much clearer than the grainy footage the prosecution had presented. Every detail was visible, from the rows of candy bars near the register to the reflective strips on the floor, even the dust motes floating in the air. The store's "Open 24 Hours" sign cast a neon glow through the front windows, creating shadowy patterns on the linoleum floor. A rack of newspapers stood undisturbed near the entrance, tomorrow's headlines waiting to be read. Two figures burst through the door, the bell above it jingling violently and swinging wildly on its mount. Even with masks covering their faces, there was no mistaking their pale skin tone and muscular builds. They moved with aggressive purpose, one significantly taller than the other, his head nearly touching the top of the doorframe. Their dark hoodies billowed as they rushed inside, the fabric rippling with their movements. The shorter one stumbled slightly over a floor mat, catching himself on a display rack, sending packets of gum scattering across the floor. The jury members shifted forward in their seats, some squinting, others exchanging meaningful glances. One juror even pulled out her reading glasses for a better look, polishing them nervously with the edge of her blouse. Another juror started scribbling furiously in his notepad, his pen scratching against the paper. The room crackled with electric tension as the truth began to unfold before their eyes. An elderly juror in the back row leaned forward so far she nearly fell off her seat. Janice stood beside the screen, her finger hovering over the pause button, confidence radiating from her stance. She let the footage play for a few more seconds before freezing it on a clear shot of the perpetrators, their builds and movements nothing like the twin sisters. The height difference between the two robbers was particularly striking in this frame, made even more obvious by the height markers on the doorframe behind them. "Does this look like my clients?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge, her voice steady and unwavering. "Objection!" Harrington's voice cracked as he shot to his feet, his face flushed red with panic and embarrassment. His hands gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles turned white, the wood creaking under his grip. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized his carefully constructed case was unraveling before his eyes. His tie hung loosely around his neck, as if he'd been tugging at it nervously. A pen rolled off his table and clattered to the floor, but he didn't even notice. Judge Tate looked exhausted as he massaged his temples, the morning light catching the silver in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes. His black robe seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders as he leaned forward in his chair. "Overruled," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Continue, Ms. Thompson." He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted it to his lips. The footage resumed playing, filling the silent courtroom. The two men ransacked the store, their movements jerky and panicked, lacking any semblance of planning. Candy bars and cigarette packs scattered across the floor as they grabbed frantically at the register, knocking over displays in their haste. A rack of magazines toppled with a loud crash, sending glossy pages sliding across the floor. A display of chip bags exploded as one of the robbers stumbled into it. Then they fled, disappearing through the front door at exactly 10:52 p.m., leaving chaos in their wake, the security camera capturing every destructive moment. Janice clicked to another video file, her movements deliberate and confident, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This is from Mrs. Rodriguez's home security camera just 3 blocks away. The timestamp showed 10:57 p.m., Malia and Marissa clearly visible walking home from their study group, books clutched to their chests, their faces illuminated by the street lamps, their peaceful demeanor a stark contrast to the violent robbery. They were even laughing about something, their breath visible in the cool night air. The sisters' matching backpacks swung gently as they walked, completely unaware of the crime that had just occurred nearby. In his private office across town, Senator Caldwell watched the proceedings on his tablet, his usually composed demeanor crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, knocking over an empty coffee cup in the process. Dark liquid seeped into his expensive desk calendar, staining the pristine pages with spreading brown circles, each one like a countdown to his impending downfall. The leather of his chair creaked as he shifted uncomfortably, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. Family photos on his desk seemed to mock him now, their smiling faces a reminder of everything he stood to lose. With shaking fingers, he dialed a number he'd hoped he'd never have to use, his breathing shallow and uneven, sweat dampening his collar. The phone felt slippery in his grip as he waited for an answer. When the line connected, his voice was barely more than a whisper, fear evident in every syllable, the tremor in his words betraying his mounting panic. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, his once confident and imposing demeanor now shattered, replaced by a haunted, desperate expression. The city skyline beyond his office window seemed to loom over him, a silent witness to his unraveling world. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crowded courtroom as the final frame of the security footage froze on the screen. 2 white males, not Malia and Marissa Whitaker, stood frozen in time. The real perpetrators caught in the act, their faces clearly visible in the high-resolution image that dominated the room. Their features were sharp and distinct, leaving no room for doubt or misidentification. The timestamp in the corner blinked steadily, marking the exact moment when truth finally emerged from shadow. The grainy green numbers seemed to pulse with accusation, each flash a reminder of the months of lies that had preceded this moment. A murmur rippled through the gallery as people leaned forward, straining to memorize every detail of the faces that had caused so much pain. Some gasped audibly, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the clear evidence before them. The image quality was so crisp that even the smallest details were visible. A distinctive scar on one man's chin, a tattoo peeking from beneath the other's sleeve. The truth was undeniable, captured in pixels and light for all to see. Dorothy Whitaker sat rigidly in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap until her fingers ached with the pressure. Her wedding ring, worn smooth by years of worry, pressed painfully into her skin. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely, determined to maintain her composure. She watched as Janice turned to face the jury, her movements deliberate and controlled, radiating quiet confidence. The attorney's navy suit seemed to gather strength from the streaming sunlight, her shoulders squared with determination as she prepared to deliver the final blow to the prosecution's crumbling case. A thin shaft of light caught the silver streak in her hair, lending her an almost ethereal authority. The clicking of her heels against the polished floor echoed like a metronome as she approached the jury box. Dorothy's heart pounded with each step, knowing these moments could change everything for her daughters. Her chest tightened with a mixture of hope and fear as she watched the scene unfold before her. "You've seen the truth," Janice said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, steady and unwavering. Her words resonated with the weight of certainty, each syllable precise and measured. My clients weren't even there, so why were they arrested? Why were two innocent young women targeted and their lives upended? What drove this rush to judgment? Her words cut through the tension like a blade through silk, each question more pointed than the last. The passion in her voice made several jurors lean forward, drawn in by the raw honesty of her delivery. She gestured emphatically toward the screen, her movements sharp and precise. Behind her, the frozen image of the real perpetrators loomed large on the screen, a silent testament to the truth of her words. Her eyes blazed with righteous indignation as she continued to hold the jury's rapt attention. The force of her argument seemed to press against the very walls of the courtroom, demanding justice with every word. The questions hung heavy in the air like storm clouds before a downpour. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions troubled as they processed the implications. One older woman in the front row removed her glasses and wiped them nervously with a tissue, her hands trembling slightly. Her pearl necklace clicked softly against her collar as she shook her head in dismay. A middle-aged man in the second row frowned deeply, scribbling notes on his legal pad, the scratch of his pen audible in the hushed courtroom. His jaw clenched and unclenched as he wrote, each movement betraying his growing anger at the injustice being revealed. The prosecutor slumped slightly in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under the harsh light of truth. His tie hung loose at his neck, and beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead as the weight of his mistake pressed down on him. His legal pad lay untouched before him, its blank pages a testament to his inability to counter the overwhelming evidence of his error. The weight of his misconduct seemed to physically push him deeper into his chair, as the truth of his rushed judgment became impossible to deny. At the defense table, Malia and Marissa clutched each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Their breath hitched in their throats as they watched the reaction unfold, afraid to hope but unable to stop the flicker of possibility from igniting within them. Malia's lips trembled as she fought to control her emotions, while Marissa blinked rapidly, her chest rising and falling with the force of her suppressed sobs. They had waited months for this moment, endured scrutiny, humiliation, and fear. Now, at last, they could see a light at the end of the tunnel, the faintest possibility of freedom. Dorothy Whitaker's grip on the edge of the wooden bench tightened, her nails digging into the smooth surface as if grounding herself against the storm of emotions threatening to consume her. She had fought so hard for her daughters, sacrificed so much to prove their innocence. Every sleepless night, every desperate prayer had led to this moment. And yet, she feared that justice, so often elusive, might still slip through their fingers. She held her breath as Janice turned back to the jury, her expression fierce and unyielding. "This is more than just a mistake," Janice declared, her voice rising. "This is a failure of the system, a failure that almost cost two innocent young women their future. You have the power to correct this wrong, to ensure that justice prevails." She let the words settle, scanning the faces of each juror, willing them to see the gravity of what had transpired. Do not let prejudice or assumption dictate your verdict. Let the facts speak for themselves. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the judge, who had maintained a careful neutrality throughout the trial, seemed momentarily affected by the weight of the evidence before him. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the jury, his normally impassive face betraying a flicker of contemplation. From the prosecution's table, the lead prosecutor finally stirred, attempting to recover from the blow dealt to his case. He pushed his chair back and stood, smoothing his wrinkled shirt in a desperate attempt to regain control. Clearing his throat, he addressed the court, his voice wavering slightly. "Your Honor, the state concedes that this new evidence warrants serious consideration." The admission, though carefully worded, was a clear acknowledgement of defeat. Dorothy's breath caught. Malia let out a small, choked sob, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Marissa squeezed her sister's hand tighter, her eyes wide with disbelief. The reality of their vindication was settling in, a slow, overwhelming tide washing away months of despair. Janice allowed herself a small, victorious nod before turning back to the jury one final time. "You have seen the truth," she repeated, softer this time, her words a final plea for justice. "Now, let justice be done." The gavel echoed sharply in the chamber, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Dorothy, for the first time in months, allowed herself to hope. The truth had been revealed, and justice, at long last, seemed within reach. The morning light barely penetrated Senator Richard Caldwell's heavy office curtains, casting long shadows across the mahogany furniture. His usually pristine desk was cluttered with empty coffee cups and crumpled papers, evidence of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. 3 flat-screen TVs mounted on the wall blared different news channels, their combined noise creating a cacophony of urgent voices, but they all carried the same devastating headline. The red banner at the bottom of each screen seemed to pulse with accusation, like a digital heartbeat of doom. Breaking news: police memo reveals targeted arrest of Whitaker twins. Caldwell's hands trembled as he reached for his ringing phone, nearly knocking over his 4th cup of coffee. The bitter liquid sloshed dangerously close to crucial documents, threatening to destroy what little control he had left. Judge Tate's name flashed on the screen, a sight that used to bring comfort, but now only intensified his dread. His stomach churned with each ring, acid burning up his throat. "We need damage control. Now." Tate's voice cracked with tension, the usual judicial authority completely absent. In the background, Caldwell could hear papers rustling frantically, punctuated by what sounded like muttered curses and the slam of a drawer. Caldwell massaged his temples, feeling a migraine building behind his eyes. His silk tie felt too tight, choking him with each shallow breath. The morning's newspaper lay untouched on his desk, its headlines screaming the same story, the black ink seeming to darken with each passing minute. "Harrington needs to shut this down before it spirals. We can't let this get any worse." His voice came out hoarse, betraying his exhaustion and rising panic. There was a long pause on the other end, filled only with the sound of heavy breathing and the distant echo of phones ringing. When Tate finally spoke, his words sent chills down Caldwell's spine. "I don't think we can stop it anymore. The truth is getting out." In the courtroom, Prosecutor Harrington's usual confident stance had given way to nervous pacing, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the polished floor like an offbeat metronome. Sweat dampened his collar as he tried to regain control of the situation. His earlier smugness completely evaporated. The morning sun streaming through the high windows seemed to spotlight his discomfort, turning him into an unwilling actor on a very public stage, his every nervous tick on display. "The memo does not prove corruption." His voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. His hands fidgeted with his watch, a nervous tick he'd never shown before. The gold timepiece caught the light, drawing attention to his trembling fingers as he twisted it around his wrist again and again. "Then let's hear from someone who knows the full story." Janice's clear voice cut through his weak defense like a knife through butter. She stood tall, her expression determined, shoulders squared with newfound confidence. The light caught her face, highlighting the fierce determination in her eyes. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, suggesting she knew exactly what was coming. The prosecution calls Officer James Reynolds to the stand. Reynolds walked to the witness stand with measured steps, his police uniform slightly wrinkled from his time on administrative leave. His badge, usually polished to perfection, looked dull under the fluorescent lights, a visual reminder of his fall from grace. His eyes darted around the courtroom, taking in the packed gallery and intense media presence before settling on Janice. The weight of 2 decades of service seemed to bend his shoulders, but there was resolution in his stance. After taking his oath, Reynolds gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white against the dark wood. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as he cleared his throat. The microphone amplified his nervous swallow, broadcasting his anxiety to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "We were given orders to bring in suspects who fit the public narrative, not the real suspects. It was all orchestrated from the top down." His words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to catch or contain. Gasps erupted from the jury box, the sound rippling through the courtroom like a wave. One juror covered her mouth in shock, while another shook his head in disbelief, pen forgotten in his hand. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every damning word with mechanical precision. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, pressing down on everyone present. Several journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, their pens scratching like hungry ravens picking apart the remains of Caldwell's reputation. Harrington's face turned red, then purple with rage and panic, the color creeping up his neck like a toxic tide. His designer suit suddenly seemed too tight as he struggled to maintain composure, tugging at his collar. He slammed his folder shut with such force that papers scattered across the prosecution table, floating to the floor like falling leaves. His law clerk scrambled to gather them, only adding to the spectacle of their crumbling case. Back in his office, Caldwell watched the scene unfold on his screens, each angle showing a different view of his empire's collapse. The color drained from his face as Reynolds continued to testify, each word another nail in his political coffin. The coffee in his stomach turned to acid as years of carefully constructed power crumbled before his eyes. His family photos on the desk seemed to mock him now, reminders of everything he stood to lose. With shaking hands, he reached for the blinds and pulled them shut, plunging his office into darkness, as if he could hide from the truth that was finally coming to light. For the first time in his illustrious career, Senator Richard Caldwell felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine fear. It sat heavy in his stomach, a cold weight that told him his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The distant sound of protesters gathering outside his office window only confirmed what he already knew. There would be no escaping this storm. The chants grew louder, each voice a reminder of the justice he'd tried so hard to prevent, a chorus of accountability that would not be silenced. The courthouse's marble halls echoed with fading footsteps as the last spectators filed out. In the nearly empty courtroom, Dorothy Whitaker sat between her daughters, their hands linked in a chain of quiet strength. Malia's white blouse was wrinkled from the long day, while Marissa's fingers fidgeted with her collar. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floor, marking time's slow passage. Their bench creaked softly as they shifted, trying to find comfort in the hard wood. The air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken prayers and desperate hopes. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city, its mournful sound filtering through the thick walls. The ancient clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second echoing like a tiny hammer against their nerves. The musty smell of old wood and leather-bound law books filled their nostrils, a reminder of the countless trials that had unfolded in this very room. A janitor pushed his cart past the doorway, the wheels squeaking against the floor as he cast a sympathetic glance their way. The American flag beside the judge's bench hung limp and still, its stars and stripes a silent witness to their ordeal. Through the tall windows, they could hear the growing crowd outside. Justice for the Whitakers. The chants grew louder as more people joined the protest, their voices carrying hope and determination through the thick glass. Signs bobbed up and down in the sea of supporters, some decorated with photos of the twins, others bearing messages of solidarity. The rhythmic sound of drums added to the growing chorus of voices, creating a heartbeat of solidarity that seemed to pulse through the building's very foundations. Local news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky like metal flowers. The crowd's energy seemed to build with each passing minute, their determination growing stronger as day faded into dusk. Police officers stood at intervals along the courthouse steps, their faces impassive as they watched the peaceful demonstration unfold. Church groups had set up tables with water and snacks for the protesters, their kindness a beacon of community support. The autumn breeze carried the scent of coffee from nearby food trucks that had arrived to serve the gathering crowd. "We should eat something," Dorothy suggested softly, but neither girl moved. The weight of waiting pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. Her motherly instincts urged her to care for them, even as her own stomach churned with anxiety. She reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a package of crackers, placing them quietly on the bench between them. The wrapper crinkled in the silence, a small reminder of life's ordinary moments even in extraordinary times. Her fingers brushed against an old photo in her purse, making her heart ache with memories of happier days. She pushed the crackers closer to Malia, trying to catch her daughter's eye with a gentle smile. A tissue tucked into her sleeve was ready for tears that might fall, though she fought to stay strong for her girls. The cross pendant at her neck caught the fading light, a small comfort she often held onto during difficult moments. Her wedding ring, still worn after all these years, felt particularly heavy today. Several floors above, in a dimly lit conference room, Senator Richard Caldwell paced back and forth. His expensive shoes clicked against the hardwood floor as Prosecutor Harrington slumped in a leather chair. The evening shadows crept across the room, matching Caldwell's darkening mood. A half-empty coffee cup sat forgotten on the mahogany table, its contents long since cold. The city lights were beginning to twinkle outside the window, a stark contrast to the gloom within. A cleaning cart rattled past in the hallway, its wheels squeaking against the tile floor. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The senator's cologne hung heavy in the air, mixing with the stale coffee smell and growing anxiety. A stack of newspapers on the corner of the desk showed headlines that made both men wince. The wall-mounted television silently displayed news coverage of the protests, each image making Caldwell's jaw clench tighter. "This trial needs to end now," Caldwell snapped, his face flushed with anger. "Find a way to stall the jury." His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, betraying his growing desperation. The veins in his neck stood out as he fought to control his temper. His reflection in the window showed a man barely holding on to his composure. The gold ring on his finger caught the light as he gestured sharply, a reminder of the power he wielded. His jaw clenched tight enough to make the muscles twitch visibly. Sweat darkened the collar of his expensive dress shirt as panic began to set in. The sound of protesters below seemed to mock his every move. His campaign pin glinted mockingly on his lapel, a symbol of everything he stood to lose. Harrington loosened his tie and sighed deeply. "We're out of options. The evidence is public now. The media is watching every move." Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's cool air. His fingers drummed nervously on the armrest of his chair. Papers scattered across the table showed highlighted passages and scribbled notes, evidence of their frantic attempts to maintain control. His phone buzzed insistently with incoming messages, each one adding to the pressure building in the room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his worried face. The ice in his water glass had long since melted, leaving rings of condensation on important documents he couldn't bring himself to read. His legal pad was covered in crossed-out strategies and desperate alternatives that led nowhere. The family photo on his desk seemed to judge him silently, reminding him of the moral compromise he'd made. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people packed themselves into every available space, shoulder to shoulder on the hard wooden benches. News reporters clutched their notepads, their pens hovering expectantly, while photographers jostled for position near the walls, their cameras hanging ready around their necks. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors and illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light like tiny stars. The air conditioning hummed ineffectively against the press of bodies, and the faint scent of coffee and nervous perspiration hung in the air. A baby cried somewhere in the back, quickly hushed by its mother, while the steady tap of a court stenographer's fingers provided a quiet rhythm to the mounting tension. The creak of an opening door made several heads turn, only to return their attention to the front when it proved to be just another late arrival searching for a spot to stand. Whispered conversations rippled through the crowd like waves on a pond, rising and falling with each new arrival, until a stern-faced bailiff cleared his throat meaningfully. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of paper or squeak of shoes against the floor. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, its mournful sound filtering through the thick courthouse walls like a warning. Judge Tate sat at his bench, his face a mask of careful neutrality beneath his silver-streaked hair. His fingers drummed silently on the polished wood as the jury filed in one by one, their footsteps echoing in the hushed room like a slow heartbeat. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, making it hard to breathe. His weathered hands smoothed down his black robes, a nervous gesture he'd developed over 30 years on the bench. A gold wedding band caught the light as his hands moved, a reminder of the life that waited beyond these walls. The American flag behind him stirred slightly in the artificial breeze, its rich colors a stark contrast to the muted wood paneling of the courtroom. His reading glasses sat perched at the edge of his nose, and a stack of carefully arranged papers waited before him, each page potentially holding life-changing words. The weight of responsibility seemed to press down on his shoulders as he adjusted his position in the high-backed leather chair, its familiar creak barely audible in the tense atmosphere. A half-empty water glass sat near his right hand, condensation slowly pooling at its base on the polished wood. Malia and Marissa sat perfectly still, their white blouses crisp against their dark skin, hands clasped tightly together on the table, knuckles white with tension. Dorothy reached for both their hands, squeezing tightly, her warmth steady and reassuring like an anchor in a storm. The twins had barely slept the night before, their eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but bright with hope. Their shoulders straight, despite the weight of everything riding on this moment. Tiny beads of sweat gathered at their temples, the chain of their matching silver necklaces, birthday gifts from their mother, glinted in the morning light. A small scuff on Marissa's shoe betrayed her nervous habit of tapping her foot, while Malia's perfectly folded tissue waited untouched beside her trembling hand. The gentle clicking of the wall clock seemed to echo their racing heartbeats as they waited for the moment that would determine their future. Dorothy's prayer bracelet clinked softly as she adjusted her grip on her daughter's hands, her faith carrying them all through this impossible moment. Behind them, several rows of community supporters wore matching purple ribbons pinned to their lapels, a silent show of solidarity that brought tears to Dorothy's eyes whenever she caught a glimpse of them. The familiar faces from their church, neighborhood, and school offered silent nods of encouragement whenever their eyes met, their presence a testament to the bonds of community that had grown stronger through this ordeal. A gentle breeze from the air vent ruffled the pages of their lawyer's legal pad, sending a paperclip skittering softly across the wooden table. The city pulsed with an electric energy that night, streets filled with celebration and vindication. News vans lined the blocks, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky like mechanical flowers. On every screen, social media exploded with support. Hashtag Justice for Malia and Marissa and hashtag End Systemic Racism dominating trending lists across platforms. People gathered on street corners, holding up phones to capture the historic moment, their faces lit by the glow of victory. Car horns honked in celebration, and strangers hugged each other on sidewalks, sharing in the collective joy of justice finally being served. Inside the Whitaker home, warm light spilled from the windows into the evening darkness. The aroma of Dorothy's cooking filled every corner, her famous pot roast, green beans with almonds, and sweet potato pie. It was the same meal she'd prepared the night everything changed, but this time, nothing would interrupt their family dinner. The kitchen counter still held traces of flour and the mixing bowls she'd used to make everything from scratch, just as her mother had taught her. The radio played softly in the background, old gospel songs mixing with the sounds of contentment. "Pass the rolls, please," Marissa said, her voice light and free for the first time in months. Malia reached across the table, nearly knocking over her water glass in the process. Both sisters burst into giggles, the sound of their laughter echoing off the walls like music. The tension that had haunted their shoulders for so long had finally melted away. They couldn't stop smiling, catching each other's eyes across the table with looks of pure relief. Dorothy watched her daughters from the head of the table, her eyes glistening. She'd set the table with her best china, the set her grandmother had given her, and placed a vase of fresh flowers in the center. Every detail was perfect, just as she'd imagined during those long months of separation. The candlelight cast a soft glow on their faces, making the moment feel almost magical. Her heart swelled with pride and gratitude as she watched her girls whole and free and together again. Across town, in the stark fluorescent light of his office, Prosecutor Harrington methodically packed his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. His law degree, once proudly displayed, now lay face down on his desk beside a single sheet of paper, his resignation letter. The words, "effective immediately," stood out in bold black ink. Photos of his family stared back at him accusingly as he wrapped them in newspaper. Empty coffee cups and crumpled papers littered his desk, evidence of his final frantic attempts to save his career. His hands trembled as he removed his nameplate from the door. 20 years of building his career, gone in a single case. He knew there would be investigations, disciplinary hearings, possibly even criminal charges. The weight of his choices pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The empty halls echoed with his footsteps as he made his final walk of shame. Security waited by the elevator, ready to escort him from the building. Meanwhile, in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, Senator Richard Caldwell paced his study, crystal tumbler in hand. His team of lawyers sat around the massive mahogany table, their expressions grim. The leather chairs creaked with tension as they shifted uncomfortably. Outside, the manicured lawns and carefully tended gardens seemed to mock the chaos unfolding within. "Damage control," Caldwell muttered, his voice rough with anger. "We sue for defamation. We spin this as a witch hunt against my family." Ice clinked against glass as his hand shook. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's perfect climate control. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly felt too tight, suffocating. His lead lawyer, a man who'd defended him for decades, slowly shook his head. "Richard, no one's buying it anymore. The evidence is too clear, the public too invested. Any attempt to fight this will only make things worse." The other lawyers nodded in silent agreement, their expensive suits and carefully neutral expressions unable to hide their growing unease. Caldwell's face twisted with rage. "I'm not done," he snarled, slamming his glass down hard enough to crack it. But beneath the anger, fear flickered in his eyes. He knew the truth. His empire was crumbling. The distant sound of protesters could be heard even through the mansion's thick walls. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from political allies eager to distance themselves. In a small diner on the edge of town, Prescott sat alone in a worn vinyl booth, staring into a cup of black coffee. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of worry and regret etched there. The late-night regulars paid him no attention as they nursed their own cups of coffee and regrets. A tired waitress refilled cups mechanically, her shoes squeaking against the checkered floor. The bell above the door chimed softly as Janice entered, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She slid into the booth across from him, ordering coffee when the waitress passed by. The smell of grease and burnt coffee hung in the air. An old jukebox in the corner played forgotten country songs. "You did the right thing," she said simply, studying his face. Her eyes held a mix of compassion and determination. Her hands wrapped around the warm mug as if drawing strength from its heat. Prescott nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "But I lost everything in the process." His voice was heavy with the weight of consequences. His career, his reputation, his connections. The morning paper lay folded beside him, his name splashed across the headlines. His tie hung loose around his neck, his shirt wrinkled from hours of worry. Janice's lips curved into a knowing smirk. "Then maybe it's time to start over." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. The gesture carried more comfort than words could express. Prescott looked up, considering her words. For the first time in years, a glimmer of hope sparked in his tired eyes. Through the diner's grimy windows, he could see the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. The night was ending, and with it perhaps the darkness that had haunted them all. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty blinds of Prescott's cramped office. The space felt worlds away from his former chambers, with its peeling wallpaper and a desk that wobbled whenever he shifted his weight. A steady stream of traffic noise filtered through the thin walls, punctuated by the voices of reporters still camped outside the building. The faint smell of stale coffee and old paper hung in the air, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. A police siren wailed in the distance, its mournful sound fitting his mood perfectly. The occasional rumble of the ancient heating system made the walls shudder, adding to the building's general air of decay. Paint chips occasionally drifted down from the ceiling like bitter snowflakes, dotting his desk with tiny white specks. Former Judge Prescott's testimony proved crucial in exposing. One reporter's voice drifted up, followed by another's eager response. He could hear the shuffle of their feet on the sidewalk below, the occasional click of camera shutters. Someone shouted a question, their words lost in the general murmur of the crowd. A news van's engine idled nearby, its mechanical hum a constant backdrop to the media circus. Prescott's eyes fell on the stack of legal documents before him, his resignation, his testimony transcripts, his confession. Each paper represented another piece of his old life crumbling away. His law degree still hung on the wall, though now it seemed to mock him rather than inspire pride. The gold frame had dulled over the years, much like his own integrity. The glass was smudged with fingerprints he couldn't bring himself to clean away. A thin layer of dust had settled on the frame's edge, marking time's steady passage. The morning light caught each dust mote, making them dance like tiny accusers in the air. The cheap desk lamp flickered, casting uneven light across the scattered papers. Outside his door, footsteps passed regularly. Other tenants in the building, probably wondering about their new neighbor, the disgraced judge who had traded his reputation for the truth. Sometimes he heard their whispers, saw their sideways glances when he passed them in the hallway. The fluorescent lights in the corridor buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen from his previous life of mahogany and marble. A water cooler gurgled somewhere down the hall, its periodic bubbling adding to the building's symphony of small, depressing sounds. The metallic taste of tap water from the building's ancient pipes lingered on his tongue. When his phone rang, the sound seemed to fill the entire tiny office, echoing off the bare walls. Dorothy's name appeared on the screen, making his heart skip. His finger hovered over the answer button as memories flooded back. Family dinners, birthday celebrations, moments that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. He could still remember the sound of the girls' laughter, the way Dorothy's eyes used to light up when she smiled. The scent of her favorite jasmine perfume seemed to ghost through his memory. Finally, he pressed accept, his thumb trembling slightly as it touched the screen. The phone felt slick in his sweaty palm. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, scratchy with emotion. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. The sound echoed in the empty room. A passing truck's rumble made the windows rattle in their frames. Dorothy's voice was controlled, measured, but he could hear the tension beneath her words. "I thought you should know. They're adjusting. Malia's preparing for college. Marissa's focusing on basketball. They're finally moving forward." Each word seemed carefully chosen, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation. He could hear dishes clinking in the background of her call, fragments of her normal life continuing without him. The steady rhythm of a kitchen timer ticked away in the distance. Prescott's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. The plastic case creaked under the pressure. That's good." The words felt inadequate, but nothing else seemed right. 1,000 apologies died on his tongue. His free hand fidgeted with a pen on his desk, rolling it back and forth. The metal clip caught the light with each turn, flashing like a distant signal. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and shared history. He could almost picture her expression, the same steady gaze she'd always had, even in their worst moments. The quiet ticking of his wall clock marked each passing second. A car horn honked outside, the sound jarring in the stillness. Someone laughed on the street below, the sound drifting up like a memory of happier times. A door slammed somewhere in the building, making him flinch. Finally, Dorothy broke the silence with a slow exhale. "I don't know if you did it out of guilt or love, but either way, thank you." Her voice caught slightly on the last word, betraying a hint of the emotion she was trying so hard to contain. Paper rustled on her end of the line, perhaps a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. The distant sound of a television news report filtered through, probably covering the very story that had brought them to this moment. The line went dead before he could respond, leaving him alone with the dial tone and his thoughts. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he lowered it to the desk, the screen going dark, like a light being snuffed out. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened surface, a ghostly reminder of his choices. A small crack in the corner of the screen split his image, making it seem even more fractured. The crack seemed to grow deeper with each passing day, like the widening gulf between his past and present. The emptiness hit him then, a vast hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of moral righteousness could fill. His eyes swept across his tiny office, taking in the bare walls, the second-hand furniture, the box of personal items he hadn't bothered to unpack. A family photo peeked out from the top, its corner bent and yellowed with age. Malia and Marissa's young faces smiled up at him, frozen in time at a happier moment. Their school uniforms were crisp and new, their matching ribbons perfectly tied, a snapshot of innocence he'd helped preserve, albeit far too late. The edges of the photo were worn smooth from years of handling, like worry stones in his pocket. He had done the right thing finally. He had helped save 2 innocent young women. He had exposed corruption that ran deep through the system he'd once served. But sitting alone in his dimly lit office, surrounded by the wreckage of his career, Prescott couldn't shake the weight of his solitude. The silence pressed in around him like a physical presence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the steady drip of a leaky faucet in the bathroom down the hall. Each drop seemed to count down the moments of his new life, marking time in this unfamiliar existence. The rhythm of the drips matched his heartbeat, a metronome of regret. He leaned back in his chair, the cheap plastic creaking under his weight, and stared up at the water-stained ceiling tiles. A spider had made its home in one corner, its delicate web catching the last rays of sunlight. The burden of secrecy was gone, but in its place sat something else. Something that felt remarkably like regret, not for what he'd done, but for all the years he'd waited to do it. For all the moments lost, all the trust broken, all the love squandered. The spider in its web seemed to watch him, a silent witness to his isolation. As darkness crept into the room, the web gleamed like strands of silver, beautiful in its fragility, much like the truth he'd finally chosen to tell. The spider moved slightly, adjusting its web, each movement precise and purposeful, unlike his own fumbling attempts to rebuild his life from the ruins of his choices. The late afternoon sun filtered through the newly cleaned blinds of Prescott's modest office, casting long golden shadows across the polished desk. Though still small, the space had begun to take on a different character, transforming from a bare room into something that felt alive with possibility. Legal texts lined a simple bookshelf, their spines creating a pattern of muted colors against the wall, and a potted peace lily, a thoughtful gift from Janice, added a touch of life to the corner. The fresh scent of lemon cleaner still lingered in the air, mixing with the subtle aroma of coffee from his morning cup and the faint mustiness of old law books. A few framed certificates hung on the wall, slightly crooked, testament to his recent return to practice. Terrence Miller sat across from him, his work uniform still on from his morning shift, the blue collar wrinkled from a long day of physical labor. His fingers twisted nervously in his lap as he explained his situation, voice barely above a whisper, shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller in the unfamiliar surroundings. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature of the room, occasionally dripping down to stain the collar of his uniform. Dark circles under his eyes revealed sleepless nights spent worrying about his situation. "They said I stole from my job," Terrence said, his eyes fixed on the floor, where his worn work boots scuffed against the carpet, leaving tiny indents in the fibers. His voice cracked slightly as he continued, "But I swear I didn't. They just don't want me working there, never did if I'm being honest." His hands clenched and unclenched rhythmically, betraying his anxiety. Prescott leaned forward in his chair, which no longer creaked under his weight. The leather felt smooth and professional beneath him, a small reminder of how far he'd come. The afternoon light caught the nameplate on his desk, making the engraved letters gleam. "Show me the evidence, every detail matters." He pulled out a yellow legal pad, pen poised and ready. With trembling hands, Terrence pulled out a worn manila folder, its edges softened and dog-eared from being carried around for days in his work bag. Inside, Prescott found security reports, timestamps, and employee records, each page telling its own story. The papers rustled softly as he sorted through them. Some stuck together from nervous sweat, others creased from repeated folding. As he flipped through the pages, his judicial training kicked in automatically, like muscle memory awakening from a long sleep. The inconsistencies jumped out at him like neon signs, altered timestamps that didn't match up, contradictory witness statements that fell apart under scrutiny, and a pattern of targeted surveillance that made his jaw clench and his stomach turn with familiar disgust. Each document revealed another layer of calculated discrimination poorly disguised as procedure. The familiar fire of injustice burned in his chest, hot and demanding, impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about theft. It was about power, prejudice, and persecution, a story he knew all too well. The same ugly pattern he'd seen destroy countless lives, including Malia and Marissa's. His fingers tightened on the paper's edge until the corners crumpled slightly beneath his grip, the sound of crinkling paper loud in the quiet room. The memory of the twins' case sent a sharp pang through his chest, fueling his resolve. "Mr. Miller," Prescott said, his voice gentle but firm, like a father speaking to a scared child who needed reassurance. "I see several problems with their case against you, problems that won't hold up under proper scrutiny." He tapped his pen against the most glaring inconsistency, leaving a small mark that he'd later highlight. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a drumbeat of determination. For the first time since entering the office, Terrence looked up, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle coming to life in a dark room. His shoulders straightened just slightly, as if some invisible weight had begun to lift. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable, like a flower beginning to turn toward the sun. His hands finally stilled in his lap. The door opened with a soft click, and Janice walked in, her briefcase swinging at her side, heels tapping confidently against the floor in a familiar rhythm. Her navy suit was crisp despite the late hour, her presence immediately filling the small space with energy. She paused, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows, her experienced gaze assessing the situation instantly, reading the room like a well-worn legal brief. The faint scent of her signature perfume drifted through the air, adding another layer to the office's evolving atmosphere. "Didn't think you'd take on new cases," she teased, leaning against the doorframe with casual grace. Her smile was knowing, almost proud, with just a hint of satisfaction, as if watching a plan unfold exactly as she'd hoped. The afternoon light caught the silver strands in her hair, making them shine like threads of wisdom earned through years of legal battles. A case file was tucked under her arm, ready for their next challenge. Prescott allowed himself a small smirk, feeling the familiar excitement of a challenge ahead coursing through his veins. "Turns out, I don't like sitting still. Never really did." His fingers drummed a quiet rhythm on the stack of papers before him. The sound matched his quickening heartbeat, alive with purpose once again. "Welcome to the real fight, Prescott." Janice grinned, stepping fully into the office and claiming her space. She nodded respectfully to Terrence before settling into the chair beside him, her presence adding strength to the room like a foundation stone being set in place. The leather squeaked softly as she adjusted her position, already reaching for her reading glasses. Her movements were precise and practiced, the motions of someone who had fought countless battles in rooms just like this. As Prescott studied Terrence's file again, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the twins' trial. Purpose, pure, and strong. The weight of the documents in his hands wasn't a burden anymore. It was a chance to make things right, to balance the scales of justice that had tipped too far for too long. Each page represented not just evidence, but an opportunity for redemption, a chance to fight back against the system that had nearly broken him. The afternoon light seemed to grow stronger, as if nature itself approved of this moment of renewal. He looked down at Terrence's file, his determination solidifying like steel being forged in fire. The system may have destroyed him once, left him broken and questioning everything he believed in. But now? Now he's fighting back with everything he's learned, and this time he knows exactly what he's up against. The game hasn't changed, but the player has, and Prescott felt ready for whatever battle lay ahead. His pen moved across the legal pad with renewed purpose, mapping out their strategy for the fight to come. Each word he wrote felt like a promise, to Terrence, to himself, and to all those who had been wronged by a system that needed to change. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Prescott stood at the defense table, his posture straight but relaxed, a stark contrast to his days as a judge. His simple navy suit and minimal briefcase reflected his new life, fighting for justice from the other side of the bench. The change still felt strange some days, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet, but he was learning to embrace it. The familiar scent of wood polish and old leather bindings brought back memories of his time on the bench, now tinged with both regret and purpose. His fingers absently smoothed his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed since switching sides. "Your Honor," Prescott's voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom, "Keisha Harper's conviction rests on evidence that doesn't hold up to scrutiny." His fingers traced the edge of the manila folder before him, each document inside carefully organized to build his case. The papers beneath his fingertips represented months of meticulous work, late nights poring over transcripts and evidence logs. Every highlighted passage and sticky note marked another crack in the prosecution's case. Judge Martinez peered down at him, her expression stern beneath her silver-streaked hair. Her weathered hands clasped together on the bench as she asked, "Why should this case be reopened, Mr. Prescott?" Her voice held the weight of decades on the bench, each word measured and deliberate. Taking a deep breath, Prescott squared his shoulders, because she was convicted on faulty evidence, just like Malia and Marissa Whitaker. His voice didn't waver as he spoke the names that had changed the course of his life. The names sent ripples through the courtroom. Whispers bounced off the wooden walls as people shifted in their seats, the rustle of clothing and murmured conversations filling the air. The Whitaker case had become synonymous with exposing corruption, and everyone knew Prescott's role in it. Some faces in the gallery showed recognition, others judgment. A few older attorneys in the front row exchanged knowing glances, having witnessed firsthand his transformation from judge to advocate. One veteran lawyer shook his head slowly, perhaps remembering Prescott's former reputation for harsh sentences. As he laid out his arguments, pointing to inconsistencies in witness statements and questionable police procedures, Prescott felt a familiar presence in the room. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced toward the back, spotting them, Malia and Marissa Whitaker, sitting quietly in the last row. Their unexpected appearance made his throat tighten, his carefully prepared words momentarily jumbling in his mind. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, making them look older than their years. Malia sat perfectly still, her keen eyes following every movement, analyzing every word like the scholar she was. Her notebook lay unopened in her lap, her full attention fixed on the proceedings. The college textbook peeking from her bag spoke of the normal life she'd fought to reclaim. Beside her, Marissa leaned forward slightly, her athletic frame tense with attention, one knee bouncing with barely contained energy. A basketball jacket was draped over her chair, suggesting she'd come straight from practice. Their presence was unexpected, and for a moment, Prescott's voice faltered. But he pressed on, stronger now. He detailed the flaws in Keisha's case, drawing parallels to other wrongful convictions, his voice growing more passionate with each point. The afternoon wore on, sunlight shifting to golden hues across the floor, until Judge Martinez called an end to the day's proceedings. The sharp rap of her gavel echoed through the chamber, bringing the session to a close. The sound reverberated through the high ceiling, a familiar punctuation to the day's events. As Prescott gathered his papers, organizing them with careful precision, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he found himself face to face with the Whitaker twins. The empty courtroom suddenly felt smaller, the air heavy with unspoken history. The echo of their footsteps faded into silence. Malia stood with her arms crossed, her expression guarded but not hostile. Her college ID badge still hung from her neck, suggesting she'd come straight from class. The lanyard bore her university's colors, a reminder of the future she'd fought to reclaim. A textbook on constitutional law was tucked under her arm. "Didn't think you'd be working on cases like this." Prescott set down his briefcase, giving them his full attention. His hands settled on the table's edge, steadying himself. The wood felt cool beneath his palms. "I wasn't sure I would either," he admitted, his voice quiet and honest. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. The weight of their shared past hung between them like an invisible curtain, heavy with memories both bitter and transformative. The twins exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations that only they could understand, a language built from years of shared experiences and trials overcome together. A slight nod passed between them, imperceptible to anyone who didn't know them well. After a moment, Marissa turned back to him. Her eyes were sharp, but held something new. Maybe respect, maybe acceptance. The fierce determination he remembered was still there, but tempered now with something else. The championship ring on her finger caught the light, a symbol of her resilience. "Good," she said firmly. "Keep doing it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. As they turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing in the nearly empty courtroom, Prescott remained still. It wasn't forgiveness, he knew that. But it was something. A crack in the wall, a small step forward. Their synchronized stride spoke of the unshakable bond between them, a strength that even his worst decisions hadn't been able to break. Their shadows stretched long behind them, merging with the afternoon light. The acknowledgement from the two young women whose lives he'd nearly destroyed felt like a weight lifting, even if just slightly from his shoulders. In the fading light of day, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible one small case at a time. The setting sun painted the courtroom in amber hues, a fitting backdrop to this moment of tentative grace. Dust motes danced in the slanting rays, giving the scene an almost ethereal quality, as if the very air was charged with possibility. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Prescott's office windows, highlighting the towering stacks of case files that had become a familiar sight. His small practice had grown steadily over the past year, with more and more people seeking his help against a system he once represented. The irony wasn't lost on him as he reviewed yet another wrongful conviction case. His reading glasses perched low on his nose as he made careful notes in the margins. The weight of each file represented someone's life derailed, someone's family torn apart, just like he had once done to the Whitakers. A gentle knock interrupted his concentration. When he looked up, Dorothy Whitaker stood in his doorway, her expression unreadable. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly, the same strength and dignity she'd shown throughout the trial still evident in her bearing. The sight of her made his throat tighten with memories of courthouse corridors and bitter accusations. He noticed how she held herself, straight-backed and proud, just as she had during those terrible days in court. "I don't know why I'm here," she said, stepping inside. Her fingers twisted the strap of her worn leather purse nervously. The afternoon light caught the silver strands in her hair, reminding him of how much time had passed since they'd first met, when her hair had been purely dark brown. The years had left their mark, but they'd only seemed to strengthen her resolve. Prescott set down his pen, his heart racing despite his calm exterior. The familiar scent of her perfume, subtle vanilla and jasmine, brought back a flood of memories he'd tried to suppress. "Then why did you come?" His voice came out softer than he intended, betraying the emotion he struggled to contain. Dorothy moved further into the office, taking in the cramped space with its worn furniture and overflowing filing cabinets. She remained standing, maintaining a careful distance, as if proximity might make this moment more difficult than it already was. Her eyes lingered on the pro bono cases stacked in one corner, their red stamps visible even from where she stood. She seemed to be weighing each word carefully before speaking. "I thought you should know." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her purse strap. "Malia got a scholarship, full ride to Georgetown Law." A hint of pride crept into her voice, lighting up her face. "And Marissa, she signed with a professional basketball team in Europe. They leave next month." Her chin lifted slightly as she spoke of their achievements, the way it always did when she talked about her girls. The love in her voice was unmistakable. a mother's pride shining through despite the circumstances. Prescott nodded slowly, absorbing the news. His chest tightened with a mixture of pride and regret, remembering the bright-eyed teenagers they'd once been. They deserve it, after everything. The words felt inadequate against the weight of their shared history, years of pain and mistrust hanging between them like a heavy curtain. He wanted to say more, but knew better than to try. Dorothy's expression softened slightly, the stern lines around her mouth easing. "They're not ready to forgive you," she said quietly. "But they don't hate you either. Not anymore." Her hands had stopped fidgeting with her purse, steady now with resolution, her wedding ring catching the light as she adjusted her grip. There was something different in her tone now. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps the absence of cold. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Prescott's hands rested flat on his desk, steadying himself against the weight of her words. The distant sound of traffic filtered through the windows, a reminder of the world continuing beyond this moment. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance, its cry fading into the city's constant hum. "I understand," he managed. And he did. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, not completely. The realization settled in his chest like a stone, both painful and somehow freeing. It was a truth he'd been moving toward for years. Dorothy adjusted her purse strap, preparing to leave. "You're doing good work here," she observed, glancing at the files scattered across his desk and pinned to the walls. "Helping people who need it." There was a hint of approval in her tone that hadn't been there before, a slight warmth that felt like the first thaw after a long winter. Her eyes swept across the cramped office one last time, taking in the evidence of his changed life. "It's the least I can do," Prescott replied, fighting the urge to say more, to explain, to apologize again. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat, held back by years of learned restraint. She nodded once, then turned toward the door. Without looking back, she stepped out, leaving Prescott alone in his quiet office. The click of her heels echoed with finality down the hallway, each step precise and measured. He sat in silence, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway, each click growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. The late sun continued its slow descent, shadows lengthening across his desk like reaching fingers. It wasn't the closure he wanted, but maybe it was the one he needed. Through his window, he watched her cross the street below, her blue dress a diminishing spot of color in the gathering dusk, until she turned the corner and vanished from sight. The city swallowed her up, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of redemption still to come. Senator Richard Caldwell stood at the polished wooden podium, his expensive suit doing little to mask his unease. Camera flashes lit up his face like lightning strikes, catching every twitch and bead of sweat. The grand steps of the courthouse, once his domain of power, now felt like a stage for his public undoing. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, making him feel exposed and vulnerable under its harsh glare. "Senator Caldwell," the reporters' voices blended into a demanding chorus. "What do you have to say about the falsified evidence?" Their faces were hungry for answers, notepads and microphones thrust forward like weapons. Caldwell's fingers gripped the podium edges, his manicured nails digging into the wood. His usual commanding presence had withered into something smaller, more vulnerable. The confidence that once radiated from him like heat from a furnace had cooled to barely a flicker. Even his trademark smile, the one that had won over countless voters, was nowhere to be seen. A young reporter in the front row stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Senator Caldwell, do you regret covering up the evidence?" Her eyes were steady, unflinching, as she held her microphone aloft. His face tightened, jaw clenching so hard it made a muscle jump in his cheek. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple despite the morning chill. "I have no comment at this time." The words came out stiff and hollow, nothing like his usual smooth political responses. More questions flew at him like arrows, each one finding its mark. "Did you pressure the police department? Were you involved in editing the security footage? What about your son's connection to the real perpetrators?" The crowd pressed closer, their collective energy growing more hostile with each unanswered question. James Morton, Caldwell's lawyer, leaned in close, his expensive cologne barely masking the smell of fear. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "They're pushing for criminal charges. The DA's office is building a case." Caldwell's knuckles went white against the dark wood of the podium. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The empire he'd built on favors and fear was crumbling, and for once his money and connections couldn't stop it. He could feel the weight of years of manipulation and corruption pressing down on his shoulders. His mind raced. How had it all unraveled so quickly? He had spent decades carefully constructing an impenetrable fortress of power. Every judge, every officer, every bureaucrat, he had them all in his pocket. And yet, here he stood, naked in the face of public scrutiny, his years of deceit and backdoor dealings laid bare for the world to see. As the questions continued to rain down on him, Caldwell stole a glance at the crowd. Among the sea of faces, he spotted former allies, senators, donors, high-ranking officials. Once, they would have stood by his side, offering hushed words of support and the silent promise of damage control. Now their eyes were averted, their expressions carefully blank. They had already begun to distance themselves, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. In his modest office across town, Prescott watched the live broadcast with a sense of grim satisfaction. For years, he had witnessed Caldwell's ruthless abuse of power, the way the senator had crushed anyone who dared to challenge him. Now the tables had turned, and Caldwell was the one facing the glare of public scrutiny. Prescott couldn't help but feel a twinge of vindication as he saw the senator squirm under the relentless questioning of the reporters. The camera zoomed in on Caldwell's face as another reporter asked about his involvement in the Whitaker case. For a moment, raw panic flashed in the senator's eyes, the same look Prescott had seen in countless defendants when they realized there was no escape from justice. That flash of fear told more truth than any prepared statement could have. Caldwell's carefully crafted facade of invincibility was crumbling, and Prescott knew that the truth was finally starting to emerge. Back at the courthouse, Caldwell adjusted his tie, the silk fabric suddenly feeling like a noose around his neck. His breathing was shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. He glanced toward the courthouse doors, contemplating a retreat inside, anywhere away from the ravenous press corps. But he knew there was no true escape. Morton leaned in again, this time more urgently. "We need to go. Now." Caldwell hesitated for just a second too long. A new voice broke through the noise, sending a shudder through his core. "Senator Caldwell, if you have nothing to hide, why not answer?" It was an older journalist, one he recognized from years past, someone who had once sung his praises in glossy political columns. Now, there was no deference in the man's voice, only razor-sharp skepticism. Caldwell clenched his jaw and took a step back. The movement, small as it was, did not go unnoticed. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression, every nervous tick. The courthouse doors swung open behind him and a pair of stern-looking officers emerged. For a moment, Caldwell convinced himself they were simply there for crowd control. Then, one of them locked eyes with him, and he knew. His breath hitched as the officer approached. The murmurs from the press grew into a crescendo, voices colliding in an excited frenzy. "Senator Richard Caldwell, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and evidence tampering." The words echoed, ricocheting off the stone walls of the courthouse, solidifying his worst nightmare into an unshakable reality. The senator's mouth went dry as cold steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. A stunned silence hung over the crowd before erupting into a chorus of gasps and shouted questions. The flashing cameras became a blinding storm, capturing the precise moment when the mighty finally fell. Prescott exhaled slowly as he watched Caldwell being led away, his once powerful frame slumping ever so slightly under the weight of his disgrace. This was no longer just a scandal. It was history in the making. Caldwell had spent his career burying the truth, but in the end, the truth had unearthed him. The evening shadows stretched long across Prescott's office floor as he hunched over his desk, reviewing case files under the warm glow of his desk lamp. The small space felt cozy now, filled with purpose instead of regret. Legal documents and sticky notes covered every surface, each representing someone fighting for justice. A half-empty coffee cup sat forgotten among the papers, evidence of another late night at work. The walls, once bare and impersonal, now displayed framed newspaper clippings of successful appeals and thank you letters from freed clients. A particularly touching letter from a grandmother reunited with her family held the center spot, its weathered edges speaking to how often he'd reread it. Next to it hung a child's crayon drawing of their family finally back together, its bright colors a stark contrast to the muted office tones. A knock echoed through the quiet office. Prescott glanced up, seeing a shadow move behind the frosted glass of his door, where Prescott Law was stenciled in simple black letters. He'd grown used to unexpected visitors. Desperate people often came seeking help at odd hours. But something about this knock felt different. More deliberate, more certain. His heart skipped a beat, sensing the weight of the moment before it arrived. His hands grew clammy as he pushed back from his desk, the old chair squeaking in protest. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. Malia and Marissa Whitaker stood in the hallway, their expressions unreadable. They looked different now, stronger, more confident. College life suited Malia, her posture radiating quiet determination, and Marissa carried herself with the poise of a professional athlete, her athletic frame suggesting countless hours of training. The hallway lights cast a gentle glow around them, highlighting how much they'd grown since he'd last seen them. Their matching dark blazers and composed demeanors made them look more like successful professionals than the scared teenagers he remembered. The subtle scent of their perfume wafted into the office, a sophisticated change from their younger days. "Can we come in?" Malia asked quietly, her voice carrying the same measured tone he remembered. Her eyes, sharp and analytical as ever, studied his face for any reaction. She held a leather portfolio close to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white against the dark material. Prescott stepped aside, his heart pounding. The twins entered his office, taking in the cramped space with careful eyes. Neither sat down. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words and years of complicated history between them. The ticking of his wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the tension-filled room. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city, then faded away. The rustle of their clothing seemed deafening in the quiet space. Malia spoke first, her voice steady. "You're working on wrongful conviction cases now." Her eyes lingered on a newspaper clipping pinned to his wall about his latest successful appeal. She traced the headline with her gaze, absorbing its meaning. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her portfolio, the leather creaking softly. "I am," Prescott replied simply. There was no point in elaborate explanations. The evidence of his changed focus surrounded them. His fingers nervously smoothed his tie, a habit he'd never quite broken. The silk felt rough against his fingertips, its navy blue pattern suddenly seeming too formal for this moment. Marissa's eyes swept over his cluttered desk, taking in the stacks of legal documents and case files. Her fingers tapped restlessly against her leg, a rhythm that matched her barely contained energy. "What made you change?" The question carried an edge of challenge beneath its surface. The old fire still burned in her eyes, tempered now by experience, but no less intense. Prescott exhaled slowly, choosing honesty over pride. "You did." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He resisted the urge to fill the silence with justifications or excuses. A car horn honked outside, the sound muffled by his office windows. The evening traffic was picking up, life going on as usual while this moment stretched between them. The twins exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication only they shared, a language built from years of facing challenges together. Malia turned back to him, studying his face for a long moment. "Good," she said finally. "Keep doing it." Her words carried both approval and warning, a complex mix of emotions in 3 simple words. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly overhead, casting strange shadows across their faces. They didn't linger after that. Both turned toward the door, but Marissa paused in the doorway. Without looking back, she added, Don't screw it up. Her voice held a hint of the old fire he remembered, the same determination that had gotten her through their darkest days. The leather of her jacket creaked softly as she straightened her shoulders, her athlete's posture perfect and proud. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Prescott stood rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of their words settle in his chest. It wasn't the tearful reunion he'd imagined in his darker moments. There were no dramatic apologies or instant forgiveness. The wounds were still there, healing but not forgotten. The air in the office felt different, charged with possibility and the weight of redemption. A gentle breeze from the old heating vent stirred the papers on his desk, rustling like whispered promises. He turned back to his desk, where another stack of cases awaited his attention. Their visit had given his work new meaning, a renewed sense of purpose that would fuel many more late nights to come. The grandmother's letter seemed to glow in the lamplight, a reminder of why he'd chosen this new path. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows as Prescott walked into the packed courtroom, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The familiar scent of wood polish and old leather filled his nostrils as he made his way forward, past rows of weathered wooden benches filled with spectators. A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd as he passed. At the defendant's table sat Sarah Johnson, a 17-year-old girl in a neat blue dress that made her look even younger than she was. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed downward, her shoulders tense with worry. A slight tremor ran through her fingers as she adjusted the collar of her dress, and she blinked rapidly to hold back tears. The case was painfully familiar. Another young black person accused on flimsy evidence and racial profiling. The department store claimed she had stolen expensive jewelry, despite security cameras showing someone else entirely committing the theft. The injustice of it made his stomach clench and brought back memories of too many similar cases he'd witnessed over the years. His jaw tightened as he remembered each face, each story that had ended badly because no one had fought hard enough. As Prescott set his worn leather briefcase on the table, its brass catches gleaming dully in the sunlight, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Dorothy Whitaker sat in the back row, her expression neutral but attentive, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. Her presence carried the weight of their shared history and unspoken expectations. When their eyes met, she gave him a slight nod before looking away. The simple gesture carried weight. She was watching to see if he would keep his promise to fight injustice, to be the kind of lawyer he should have been years ago. Her steady gaze reminded him of all the times he'd fallen short. The prosecutor, a young man eager to make his mark, strutted to the center of the courtroom, his new suit still carrying visible creases. His polished shoes squeaked against the floor as he moved, the sound jarring in the hushed room. "We have witness testimony placing Ms. Johnson at the scene," he declared, though his voice wavered slightly, betraying his uncertainty. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights, and he kept tugging at his too-tight collar. Prescott listened as the prosecution presented their case, each word making his determination stronger. His fingers tapped silently against his legal pad as he took notes, the familiar motion helping him focus his thoughts. A store clerk claimed to have seen a black teenager near the jewelry counter. The security guard testified about suspicious behavior, but their statements were vague, filled with assumptions rather than facts, riddled with the kind of prejudice he'd seen too many times before. Each witness seemed less certain under cross-examination. When Prescott rose to speak, his chair scraping softly against the floor, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen this playbook before and was tired of its repeated performance. "Your Honor, this entire case is built on assumptions, not facts." He moved to the center of the courtroom, his shoulders straight, his purpose clear. The sound of his measured footsteps punctuated each word. "The prosecution wants you to see what they assumed they saw, not what actually happened." The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face as he spoke, highlighting the determination in his expression. One by one, he dismantled their arguments, his experience guiding every word. He showed how the witness descriptions were inconsistent, how the security footage clearly showed a different person, how the investigation had focused on Sarah simply because she fit their preconceived notions. With each point, Sarah's posture straightened slightly, hope beginning to replace fear in her eyes. The tension in her shoulders eased incrementally as Prescott's defense unfolded. Her mother, sitting in the front row, reached forward to squeeze her hand. "Look at these police reports," he said, holding up documents, their pages worn from his careful study, edges softened from countless reviews. The papers rustled softly in the still air of the courtroom. The original description of the suspect was completely different, yet they arrested Ms. Johnson without any concrete evidence, without even basic due diligence. His words echoed in the hushed courtroom, each syllable weighted with years of witnessing similar injustices. The judge, who had started the proceedings with skepticism in her eyes, began leaning forward, paying closer attention. Her wire-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light as she studied the evidence. Her pen moved quickly across her notepad as Prescott highlighted the glaring holes in the prosecution's case, her expression growing more concerned with each revelation. The crease between her brows deepened as she considered the implications of what she was hearing. "This isn't justice," Prescott concluded, his voice firm with conviction, resonating through the now silent courtroom. "This is bias masquerading as law enforcement, and it has no place in this courtroom." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and purpose. Several jurors nodded unconsciously, caught up in the power of his argument. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Prescott gathered his materials, carefully organizing the papers that might help free an innocent young woman. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Walking past Dorothy's row, he felt her eyes on him but didn't turn. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Her presence was both a reminder and a challenge. In that moment of silent acknowledgement, he knew he had finally found his true purpose in the law, fighting for those who needed someone to stand up for them. The weight of years of regret began to lift from his shoulders, replaced by the certainty that he was finally doing what he was meant to do. His steps were lighter as he headed toward the courthouse doors, ready to prepare for tomorrow's battle. The airport buzzed with activity as travelers rushed past with rolling suitcases and carry-on bags, their wheels creating a constant hum against the polished floor. Children's excited chatter mixed with announcement calls overhead, creating that distinct symphony of airport life, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter and the beeping of luggage carts. The smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls wafted through the air, mingling with the metallic tang of recycled air conditioning and the subtle scent of leather from passing bags. A group of tourists laughed nearby, their matching neon shirts bright spots of color against the terminal's muted grays and beiges, their cameras dangling from their necks. Near them, a young family struggled with an overloaded luggage cart, the wheels squeaking in protest, while business people in crisp suits navigated the crowd with practiced ease, their briefcases held close. Prescott sat in one of the uncomfortable metal chairs near the coffee shop, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup he hadn't touched, his knuckles white from gripping it too hard, the cardboard sleeve crumpling under his fingers. From his vantage point, he could see Dorothy and the twins clearly without being obvious. Dorothy stood tall and proud, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she straightened Malia's collar one last time, her fingers lingering on the fabric. The gesture was so motherly, so protective, it made Prescott's chest tighten with regret and longing. He noticed how Dorothy's hands trembled slightly, betraying the emotion she was trying so hard to contain, her strength showing in the way she kept her chin high. She kept smoothing her daughter's clothes, touching their shoulders, memorizing their faces as if taking mental photographs to sustain her through the coming separation. Her silver bracelet caught the light as she fussed over them, the charm that both girls had given her for Mother's Day tinkling softly, the heart-shaped pendant spinning gently. "Mom, we'll be fine," Marissa said, bouncing on her heels with barely contained excitement, her eyes bright with anticipation. Her sports duffel was slung over one shoulder, basketball contract papers safely tucked in her carry-on, along with the lucky socks that had seen her through every important game. The overseas team had scouted her right after the trial, impressed by her resilience as much as her talent on the court. Her face glowed with the kind of joy that only comes from dreams finally taking flight, her smile lighting up her whole face. The championship ring on her finger caught the morning light, a reminder of all she'd overcome, its smooth surface worn from her habit of twisting it when nervous. A lucky penny she'd found during their first court appearance was still safely tucked in her shoe, a private token of perseverance that had become her silent companion through every hearing. Malia clutched her acceptance letter to Stanford Law School, her dream since childhood, now finally within reach, the envelope slightly worn from countless readings. She wore a simple navy blazer, looking every bit the future lawyer she was meant to be, her posture straight and confident. Her fingers kept smoothing the envelope's edges, as if reassuring herself it was real, the paper crinkling softly under her touch. A small golden pin, a gift from her debate team, sparkled on her lapel, representing the determination that had gotten her here despite all odds. The leather messenger bag at her feet held the journal she'd kept throughout their ordeal, its pages filled with hopes and fears now transformed into triumph, the corners dog-eared from constant reference. "I know you'll both be fine," Dorothy said, pulling them both into a fierce hug, her arms wrapping around them like she never wanted to let go, her embrace carrying years of protection and love. "But that doesn't mean I won't miss you every single day." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the depth of emotion she was fighting to control. The familiar scent of her perfume enveloped them all, a comforting reminder of home and countless morning hugs before school. She pressed her cheek against their heads, breathing in the coconut shampoo they'd shared since middle school, the scent carrying memories of countless mother-daughter moments. If you enjoyed the story of Malia, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. If you enjoyed the story of Malia, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.